network. We also call it community-supported transportation, but whatever you call it, it's a wild pile of fun. So I'm going to tell you all about it today. Start with this picture.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so we see all those cars there on the road, and each one of them has a driver, and each one of them has an awful lot of empty seats. Anybody want to guess at how many of those empty seats are actually out there? What our passenger capacity is?
At least 90%.
Well, it's about 80% of the passenger capacity that we could be putting people in is riding around empty. It's a huge amount. Now, if you squint your eyes a little bit, and you imagine that each one of those cars is a little tiny bus. Wouldn't that be an amazing transportation network?
Is that Los Angeles?
I think so, yeah. Okay, so this is what we're trying to do at Lawrence OnBoard, is to turn all those empty seats into a public transportation network. So let me tell you a little story. I was at K-State at their dialogue on sustainability over the summer, and I was in a breakout session where we were talking about ways to encourage people to behave more sustainably. And I mentioned that if you're going to change people's behavior, you need three things. You need to educate them as to why the change is important. You need to give them options and choices, because otherwise they feel helpless. And then you also need to give people incentives. You need to make those options that are more sustainable also easier, cheaper, more sexy and fun. Some reason that people have to choose the better options. So I stuck my hand up in the breakout session and told these 3 points, and then also in the general session. And afterward, a woman came up to me and she said, "So, I liked what you said about the education and the options and the incentives. Are you on the social sciences faculty here at K-State?" And I said, "Well, no, I'm a professional hitchhiker." And that's my point. I'm a professional hitchhiker. I'm also an artist. I run a small business, but I'm not an elected official. I'm not an academic. I'm not a transportation planner. I'm not a captain of industry. I'm just an ordinary citizen with a problem to solve and a big idea and a whole bunch of awesome people who are helping me out. So let me tell you about how we got to where we are right now. This is my house. My husband Tim and I moved out to Jefferson County, to the country, about 4 years ago in order to live a more sustainable lifestyle. And we cut our own firewood, we built a eco-friendly, energy-efficient building, we raise a lot of our own food, and we take public transportation whenever we can, which is never, because there isn't any. So, what do you do when you live where there's no bus? Well, you can walk. It'll take me about 5 hours to get into town. I could get on my bike on very unsafe roads and have a nice sweaty bike ride for about an hour to get into town. I could ride with a neighbor, which I've done before, but it's a big hassle to call around, find someone who's leaving the same time you are, going more or less the same place, coming back when you want to come back, and then you have this debt of obligation to your neighbor, so you don't want to use that too much. So it's kind of a big hassle. So I do what, of course, most of everybody in rural Jefferson County does, which is drive alone. Well, I spent about 3 years getting really cranky about this situation and not being able to do anything about it. And then one day, I heard a voice. I heard the voice of this guy. This is Alan Pizarski. He's a transportation scholar, and he was on a show called Freakonomics Radio. Anybody here ever listen to Freakonomics? Oh, yeah. Great show. Anyway, he was talking about how the whole 80% thing with all of our empty passenger capacity, and how we really need to fill those seats. It's the best way to get people around with infrastructure we already have, cars already on the road, but it's really hard to do. And he proposed, well, why don't we just all start hitchhiking again? Because it's really not as dangerous as people make it out to be. And he suggested if we had some way to credential hitchhikers to show that they're safe, then maybe we can start getting people to pick them up more. Well, I thought, well, dang, that's a good idea. And it was such a good idea that I thought about it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I started doing some research, and I discovered the slug lines in Washington, D.C. This is an informal form of hitchhiking. What these are all about is that people who want to use the fast carpool lanes will go to designated areas and they pick up a couple of warm bodies and take them down into the city. The drivers get there a lot faster, the riders get a free ride. It's all very informal, but they've been doing this for nearly 30 years to the tune of 10,000 people a day with no incidents of violence or mayhem or anything. And I thought, well, if we could just transfer that practice here to rural Kansas, well, we've got something going on here. So yeah, I thought about it for a long, long time, and in the end, I also talked to an awful lot of transportation professionals, rideshare people, hitchhikers, all kinds of folks, and we came up with Lawrence OnBoard. So here's how we picture it working. It's a membership-based program. Everybody registers. You can sign up as a rider or a driver or both. Everyone gets vetted, background checks, and you get a photo ID. The drivers get a window cling to show they're in the network. And the riders get one of these dry erase boards here with a Velcroed on marker. I've got one right here. Very handy. And what you do is you go to a safe roadside, you write your destination on the board, and you hold it up, and people stop and pick you up. So then, the key is that the rider, when they get in the car with the driver, they can text their member number into the club website, office, whatever, and that makes a record of the ride. And that's especially important because it's a safety backup, shows who you're with. That's a big disincentive for any kind of monkey business. It also leaves a platform for feedback, kind of eBay style, where you can rate your drivers and riders. It's also a place where you can organize lost and found. Also, that enters the driver in a drawing for a prize, and that's that incentive that we talked about. And that's really important because only about 25% of people will do this out of the kindness of their hearts. You need a little push for everybody else, and a prize is something that's kind of fun and exciting, but it avoids the awkward cash transaction in the car, and it also avoids the driver being legally considered a taxi cab. So that's really important. We'll also institute training sessions to show people how to do this smart and safe. And we'll do some information and publicity campaigns to create awareness of the program around the community, so people know what those people with the green signs are all about. All right, so it does have some limitations. Right now, we're only doing it in the daytime. It could be dangerous in bad weather if there's a lot of snow on the ground and it's not safe for people to pull over. We pretty much have decided that adults only, anyone 18 and up. We don't want teenagers doing this just yet. And also, if parents are traveling with kids, they don't know if the driver has a booster seat or a car seat available, so that is another limitation. So then we decided to test it out and see if it's going to work. Well, how do you test such a thing? It's such a new idea. We could do surveys, we could do questionnaires, or hey, I could just make myself a prototype and hit the road and try it out. So that's what I did. This is my jankety prototype. Notice the green duct tape? So I put this together just to see if it would work, and I wrote Lawrence on it in nice big bold letters, and I walked down to the blacktop out in rural Jefferson County on Wellman Road, and I held my sign up like this, and I was expecting to stand there for up to an hour and wait for someone, the axe murderer, to come and pick me up, or have to call my husband for a rescue. So I was shaking in my shoes, and guess what? The very first car that drove by gave me a ride into town, and they were lovely people, and they really got it. They said, we hate driving all the time, we would love to have alternatives. So after that experience, I thought, oh, we might have something here. So then the next step was to get a whole bunch of volunteers and to collect some data. I don't know if you could read this very well, but these are some of the data points that we were collecting. Things like, the date and who the rider was, where they started, what time they started, what they wrote on their ride board, what the temperature and the weather was all about, how fast the cars were going by, and then really important, how long they waited and how many cars passed by. Then we collected some data about the people in the vehicle, who the driver was, male or female, did they have passengers, did they have kids, where was the driver coming from, and where were they going to. And tell you what, this driver's origin and destination, that's like gold for transportation professionals, because that's a really hard thing to get. And then also we started to ask, did the driver circle around or double back to pick up the rider? Because we found about 1 out of 5 drivers, they need to think about it a little bit before they pick you up. And then where did the driver drop you off? So these are some questions that we were asking. We collected data on that. So here are some of our volunteers, and there's Connie right there. She helped me out on this. We've had 23 people going and trying this out, 14 men and 9 women. Our youngest was 18 years old, and our oldest was this guy, Michael, who's 69 years old, and he came from Washington State. He had heard about our project, came all the way from Washington State to test it out. He's been hitchhiking his whole life, and he thought it was a great time. So we've had 116 attempts so far since about this time last year. And of those, we've had 110 successful rides. The 6 rides that didn't work out, we discovered that it was more or less because the location wasn't so good. So we started figuring out, okay, well, what makes a good location? And we've hit upon 4 important things. A location has to be a place where a rider is visible, long line of sight so they can see you from far away, and not too many distractions in the background, and no crazy stuff like road construction or big tractor trailers in the way. There also has to be an easy and obvious place for the driver to pull over, otherwise they won't want to stop. There has to be an adequate traffic flow. We figure about 2 cars a minute is perfect, but as few as 1 every 5 minutes, you could still work it. A really busy street like Iowa, it's probably not so good. And then this is this last point, the turnaround down the road. That's an important one that we discovered from our data, that yeah, people need to think about it a little bit, so it's good to have a driveway or something where they can go turn around and come back for you. We've traveled 546 miles using Lawrence OnBoard. And this is the part that makes me flap my hands with excitement. Our average wait time before somebody picks us up, 6.8 minutes. Think about that, 6.8 minutes. That's way faster than the bus. Sometimes if I'm going over to, like, say, the Community Mercantile from downtown, I can go in front of the Carnegie building and put up my sign, and it takes me under 2 minutes before somebody stops. So we started thinking, well, who are these drivers who are so willing to pick up our riders, and what motivates them, and what makes this so different from long distance hitchhiking where you're waiting for hours? Well, we figured statistically about 1 out of 7 drivers passing by is going to stop. That's not very scientific, that's just a rough guess. The drivers are 65% men, 35% women, and that makes sense. Men are just more comfortable with something like this. But a lot of them had passengers, people with their kids in the car, with dogs, babies, grandmas. So it's obvious that it's a higher comfort level for people. 80% of them were random strangers, but interestingly, 20% of the people that stopped just happened to be someone we knew, or a friend of a friend, or an acquaintance. We had some connection, or they were people who knew about our program just through the grapevine. And that's kind of nice if you know that 1 in 5 drivers is going to be somebody you know right from the get-go. Now, and a really important thing is the drivers report back that one of the reasons they've stopped and picked up our riders is because of these ride boards, these dry erase boards here, because they just look a little bit something different than your cardboard. They're sturdy, they're branded, they got the club logo. They just look legitimate. Plus, oftentimes we have the volunteers wearing name tags too, and if you have a name tag on, you look like you belong somewhere. So that's a big plus. So we've kind of figured that the people who pick us up fall into several categories. This is just some observations of mine especially. I found a lot of them are former hitchhikers. They've got their own stories that they want to share, and they're really comfortable with the whole concept. So yeah, they say, oh, I used to hitch to work all the time. A lot of people from other countries will come and say, oh yeah, we hitchhike all the time in the Czech Republic, or in even Colorado and Maine. There's a strong hitchhiking culture, so those people are very comfortable. I get this a lot out in the country. Old farmers, they just get so worried that this lone woman is out there on this lonely country road, and they know that some axe murderer is going to stop by and pick me up next. I have a lot of people who've never picked up hitchhikers before, but they'll pick up me and my people because we look more legitimate. We're usually nicely dressed, we're smiling, we're waving, and we have these signs and name tags. I think that's pretty cool. People getting outside of their box. The bored commuter, a lot of people who are driving the same road every day, and we're sort of something new, something to put a little adventure in their morning. And then there are people who just stop because they see the sign, they say, well, I'm going that way too, they don't have any other reason, they just pull right on over. And that's like my favorite kind of person. All right. I also, you can break it down too by generations, and this is a really interesting thing because the reaction of the generations kind of mirrors the history of hitchhiking. People say, yeah, I used to hitchhike back all the time back in the day. People who grew up in the 40s and 50s. Well, back before about 1950s, hitchhiking was considered a neighborly thing to do. Oftentimes it was a patriotic thing to do if you picked up soldiers on furlough, or college students on their way home, or people looking for work during the Depression. I like this poster. This isn't really specifically hitchhiking, but it kind of shows the mentality. So what happened? How did it go from being, when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler, to suddenly everybody's dangerous and everybody's suspicious? Well, a lot of that had to do with the interstate highway system. People were suddenly much more mobile than they were before. You had people from parts of the country that you were not familiar with showing up in your town, and that was a little worrisome. You also had a lot of young people who were, civil rights protesters, war protesters, who were, hippie counterculture kids, beatniks. And they were much more mobile too. And in fact, the FBI, as part of their squashing of the counterculture, actually was behind a lot of the propaganda against hitchhiking, because they figure if these people aren't traveling, they're not going to disrupt society so much. So Generation X, when I was growing up, all we heard was hitchhiking is so dangerous. And it didn't help to have things like this. Yeah. So this is saying basically, hitchhikers are axe murderers and rapists. Don't hitchhike because you'll get picked up by an axe murderer and rapist. So I figure, okay, if you're a rider or a driver, both of you are axe murderers and rapists. So I looked back in my research to see how many axe murderers and rapists we had, and this is what I discovered. We had 0, either in the riders or the drivers. Now that's not to make light of the safety issue, because it is very important and it is a big concern. We do have some safety protocols and some reasons why we, oh yeah, and it doesn't help to have images like this either in the minds of your drivers. Yeah. So I wanted to know, how dangerous is it really? And I found there's really not a lot of research on this subject. The California Highway Patrol in '73 did a study, and it showed that hitchhiking was a factor in less than 1% of crimes, which is about, not really statistically significant. Their conclusion was that hitchhikers are no more likely to be victims or perpetrators than anybody else in the general public. So basically, it's about as dangerous as walking into a convenience store. It's a lot safer than riding a motorcycle or having a swimming pool in your backyard. But people associate the concept of hitchhiking with danger because you are in such close proximity to a stranger. So for me, to keep myself safe and other, especially women riders that go out, we have some ground rules. We only go in the daytime. I never get in the car if there's more than 2 men in the car. And we just kind of, make an effort to engage with the driver immediately as soon as we get in. And when we first developed this program, and for the first ride research day, the protocol was going to be that everybody needed to text in the license plate number of the driver before they got in the car, which, that's a pretty safe idea. But we found that it was so incredibly disruptive to the flow of traffic, to the flow of getting the person back on the road, and it also creates this wall of suspicion right from the get-go. And we thought, no, it's really more important to get in the car, engage with the driver, buckle your seatbelt, and get on your way. But I always make sure that I can open the passenger door from the inside before the car starts up again. That's another key one. So basically, with some common sense and some basic safety backups, we feel it's going to be pretty safe. So then the millennials, people like Connie here, oftentimes when I tell them about my program, they say, somebody ought to make an app for that. Well, guess what, millennials? Somebody has. This is the Karma car sharing app, and it's a smartphone app, and people can text in their they register and they can text in their destination and their origin and match up on the fly. Now these systems work really well in like densely populated urban areas like San Francisco, Washington, D.C., New York City. They're good to go there. But in a sprawly, low-density population center and in rural areas, it would take a really long time to get enough people all using the same smartphone app. That is, if you can even find enough rural Jefferson County residents that have smartphones, that it's probably at least 10 years in the future before this is going to be a part of the picture. However, I'm going to be talking with the people from Karma and also from Lyft and some of these other on-the-fly ride-sharing programs to see if we can get something like this in partnership with what we're doing, so people have that option. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the takeaways, what I've learned from doing this myself, because I've got a lot of data, I've got a lot of facts and figures, but what does my heart say? What have I learned personally? Well, number one, people need to feel helpful. There's a lot of people driving out there right now who have this wellspring of neighborliness and goodwill and are frustrated because they don't get opportunities to express it. And that's the beautiful thing about this program, is it not only builds a transportation network to get us where we need to go, but it also builds neighborliness and community connections. I've met so many of my neighbors that I didn't even know were my neighbors doing this rideshare. And I think that people, if they are given the opportunity to help somebody in a way that's safe and convenient, well, they'll do it. And our research bears that out.